On the evening of July the 20th, 2026, President Trump sat down at a desk in the White House and signed 3 documents that had not been used by any American president in living memory. Not since the 1940s had a single line of the Tariff Act of 1930 been invoked to actually impose tariffs on another country. That line is called Section 338. And for 80 years it sat completely dormant, a forgotten tool from the Smoot-Hawley era, gathering dust in the federal code. On that Monday night, it came back to life, aimed squarely at Canada. What followed was not the retaliation Washington expected. It was something quieter, and according to trade analysts who watched it unfold, far more calculated. And it is that calculation, not a headline explosion, that actually rattled people paying close attention to where this goes next. Before we get into what Ottawa did, it's worth being straightforward about one thing. You may have seen claims online describing a dramatic, singular market shock tied directly to Canada's response. Bond yields spiking. A specific trading session where Wall Street panicked in real time because of something Ottawa announced. We looked for a named, verifiable source describing that exact event, and we could not find one. No wire service, no named market analyst, no confirmed trading data ties a single dramatic Wall Street reaction directly to a specific Canadian countermove in the way some online summaries suggest. What we can tell you, backed by named sources, is a genuinely surprising story in its own right. The president invoked a statute that legal experts call the nuclear option of American trade law, and the Prime Minister of Canada responded not with the immediate retaliatory strike that Ottawa delivered the last 2 times Washington escalated, but with calculated restraint, a decision that trade lawyers and economists say was the actual strategic surprise in this standoff, even if it never produced the single viral market headline that some online accounts of this story have claimed. To understand why that restraint mattered, you have to understand what Section 338 actually is, and why trade lawyers started using words like Rubicon the moment it was invoked. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 gives the president the authority to impose duties of up to 50% on any country found to be discriminating against American commerce, without requiring the lengthy investigation process that other, more commonly used tariff laws demand. According to a legal alert from the law firm White & Case, this marked the first time in the statute's history that any American president had used it to actually impose tariffs, rather than simply threaten their use as leverage. Scott Lincicome, vice president of general economics at the Cato Institute, described the moment bluntly. "We crossed the Rubicon," he said in the hours after the proclamations were signed, according to reporting from Tech Times. The invocation of 338 is the nuclear option for Trump tariffs. What made it especially significant, Lincicome and other legal analysts pointed out, is that unlike the emergency powers tariffs the Supreme Court had already struck down earlier in the year, Section 338 cannot be challenged using that same legal argument. It has no expiration date built into the statute, and it gives the president explicit authority to escalate all the way to a complete import ban if a targeted country is found to have increased its discrimination in response. The 3 proclamations Trump signed that Monday each targeted a specific named grievance. According to the law firm Holland and Knight, one proclamation addressed Canada's dairy tariff rate quota system, alleging it gave European Union cheese producers better market access under Canada's trade agreement with Europe than American producers received under the USMCA. A second targeted alcoholic beverages, pointing to the fact that most Canadian provinces had pulled American liquor products off government-run store shelves in early 2025, in response to earlier American tariffs. According to the U.S. Trade Representative's own fact sheet, American alcohol exports to Canada had fallen roughly 81%, from about $718 million to just $137 million in the space of a year. The third proclamation targeted Canada's automotive sector, specifically a Canadian cap on vehicle exports from companies that had been reshoring manufacturing to the United States. Together, the 3 proclamations covered close to $20 billion of Canadian goods, or roughly 5% of everything the United States imports from Canada annually, according to figures published by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. What made Section 338 different from every other tariff tool Washington had used against Ottawa over the previous 18 months was a detail buried in the legal text, one that trade lawyers flagged almost immediately. Under the more familiar Section 232 and Section 122 authorities, goods that qualified for preferential treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement had generally been shielded, or at least treated more favorably. Section 338 works differently. According to a client advisory from the law firm GHY International, the new duties apply to covered goods, regardless of whether they carry a valid USMCA certificate of origin. A Canadian auto part, a bottle of Canadian wine, a set of hockey sticks manufactured in Ontario, none of it mattered whether the product technically complied with the Continental Trade Agreement that has governed commerce between the 2 countries for years. If it appeared on the annex list, the 50% duty applied. The list itself, according to reporting from Thomson Reuters, extended well beyond the three headline categories of autos, alcohol, and dairy into products like cement, plywood, furniture, fishing rods, clothing, wigs, and even swimming pools, a detail that caught more than a few compliance teams off guard when they scrolled past the obvious categories into the fine print of Annex 2. Washington set the effective date for 30 days after signing, 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time, August the 19th, 2026. That 30-day window was widely understood, according to analysis published by the law firm Holland & Knight, as a deadline designed to extract last-minute concessions from Ottawa rather than a hard, unmovable cutoff. And this is where the real story of Ottawa's response begins, because what Canada did with that 30-day window looked nothing like what it had done during the two previous major rounds of this trade fight. Rewind to February of 2025, when Trump first imposed tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. Then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responded within days with more than $100 billion in retaliatory tariffs of his own, delivering a somber televised address from Ottawa in which he declared, "We didn't ask for this," while announcing an initial 30 billion Canadian dollars in countermeasures set to take effect almost immediately, with a further 125 billion following close behind. That was the pattern investors and trade analysts had come to expect from Canada. Escalation matched almost dollar for dollar, announced publicly fast. When Section 338 landed on Canadian trade 5 months later, in July of 2026, that same instinct was very much alive inside Canada's government. Ontario Premier Doug Ford publicly urged what he called a dollar-for-dollar response, according to analysis from the law firm BLG. British Columbia's Premier, David Eby, took an even harder public line, telling reporters flatly, "There's not a chance in hell that you." S-alcohol is going back on the shelf in British Columbia, as reported by Benzinga. But Prime Minister Mark Carney, who had taken over from Trudeau earlier in this trade fight, did something noticeably different this time. He did not retaliate. According to reporting from The Hill, Carney told reporters in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, that Canada had a full range of things that we can do if the tariffs actually took effect, but explicitly said that retaliating immediately would be counterproductive while negotiations continued. That single word, counterproductive, is doing a lot of work because it marks a genuine strategic break from the Trudeau-era playbook of instant matched escalation. Carney's calculation, according to analysis from the law firm BLG, reflected what they described as Ottawa's acute dilemma. Domestic politics after 18 months of trade conflict rewarded firmness and a visible response, but Section 338's own legal architecture meant that any Canadian counter-retaliation could actually be used by Washington as fresh evidence that Canadian discrimination against American commerce had increased, potentially triggering the statute's escalation clause and the threatened move toward a complete import ban. In other words, the same law that gave Trump the authority to punish Canada also created a trap for any government tempted to hit back the way Canada always had before. Retaliate, and you hand Washington the legal pretext to go further. Don't retaliate, and you look weak to premiers like Doug Ford and to a Canadian public that has spent 18 months bracing for exactly that kind of fight. Carney chose the second path, deliberately, and according to BLG's analysis, pursued what they called three tracks simultaneously: a calibrated, non-escalatory public posture, formal dispute settlement mechanisms, and an intensified push at the negotiating table over the broader review of the USMCA itself. That negotiating push has been happening largely out of public view, and the most current reporting available from CBC News describes talks between Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, Chief Trade Negotiator Janice Charette, and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer as delicate and intense in the days immediately preceding the August 19th deadline. Speaking to reporters in St. John's, Newfoundland, Carney said he was deliberately avoiding public commentary on the substance of the talks, explaining in French that Canada was negotiating from what he called a position of strength, and confirming he expected to speak directly with Trump by phone within 48 hours of that statement. According to the Globe and Mail, Canadian negotiators, including LeBlanc and Charette, remained in Washington over the weekend immediately before the deadline, working to close what the paper described as a significant policy divide that still remained. What exactly is Ottawa asking for in exchange for the concessions Washington wants? According to CBC's reporting, the American side wants three specific things: American liquor products restored to the shelves of Canada's provincially run stores, the removal of Canada's retaliatory tariff on American automobiles, and adjustments to how Canada's supply-managed dairy sector allocates its quotas. In exchange, Canada wants Washington to scrap the threatened Section 338 tariffs entirely, and Carney's negotiating team has also pushed for meaningful relief on the separate pre-existing tariffs that have hit Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and softwood lumber for well over a year at this point. It's a negotiation with real teeth on both sides, not a one-way ultimatum, even though the Section 338 authority technically gives Washington the stronger legal hand. It's worth pausing on Ottawa specifically for a moment, because the political calculations happening inside the Canadian capital go beyond simply the Prime Minister's own instincts. Ottawa, as the seat of Canada's federal government, is where the tension between provincial premiers demanding a hard response and a Prime Minister's office trying to preserve negotiating room actually gets resolved, meeting by meeting. Carney's decision to meet with Canada's provincial premiers in Charlottetown before making his public statement on restraint reflects a governing reality unique to Canada's federal structure. Unlike the American president, who can act largely unilaterally on trade policy, a Canadian Prime Minister has to manage a federation where premiers like Ontario's Doug Ford and British Columbia's David Eby control real levers, including provincial liquor board policy, that Washington has explicitly identified as part of the discrimination it's punishing. That means any deal Carney's negotiators strike in Washington also has to be sellable back in Ottawa, and then sellable again to premiers who don't answer to the federal government and who have shown publicly that they're prepared to criticize a deal they see as too soft. There's a wrinkle in the American case itself, one that legal analysts have been quick to point out, and that may explain part of why Ottawa felt comfortable holding its retaliatory fire rather than escalating immediately. Section 338, according to analysis published on the trade law blog run by Professor Alan Sykes and reviewed by other trade law scholars, does not simply authorize tariffs whenever one country retaliates against another. It authorizes them specifically when a country treats American commerce worse than it treats commerce from other nations, a narrower, more specific legal test. As reporting from the Hill's opinion section pointed out, at least one of the three underlying allegations sits on genuinely shaky ground. Canada's provincial alcohol restrictions, the piece noted, were decisions made by individual provincial liquor boards, not by Ottawa itself, and Section 338 is unusual among American trade statutes in that its text arguably lets Washington treat a province's independent choice as if it were the national government's own discriminatory policy. Whether that argument survives a legal challenge in the U.S. Court of International Trade, which multiple law firms, including Holland and Knight and White and Case, say is now considered likely, remains genuinely uncertain, and it is one of the open questions Ottawa's negotiators are reportedly weighing as they decide how hard to push back at the table rather than in public statements. There's also a striking geographic pattern in which Canadian industries actually got targeted, one that trade analysts at the Hill's opinion section flagged as more than coincidental. Many of the industries covered by the three proclamations, automotive manufacturing in particular, are heavily concentrated in Ontario and Quebec, Canada's two largest manufacturing provinces, and also, not incidentally, the political base most central to federal Canadian elections. Whether that concentration reflects a deliberate pressure strategy aimed at Canada's political center of gravity, or simply reflects where Canadian manufacturing happens to be located, is a matter of interpretation rather than confirmed fact. And we want to be clear that no named you. S official has stated targeting Ontario and Quebec specifically was the intent. It's worth stepping back to note just how unusual the broader picture looks. According to analysis from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, Canada is one of only two major trading partners, the other being Brazil, that the Trump administration singled out for this kind of direct punitive escalation in the summer of 2026, specifically because Canada, alongside China, was one of the only countries to respond to the administration's earlier 2025 tariffs with actual countermeasures, rather than negotiating a deal quietly. China, CSIS noted, has largely avoided this kind of direct punishment because of its leverage over rare earth minerals critical to American manufacturing, an advantage Canada simply doesn't have in the same form. That distinction matters because it suggests Washington's choice of Canada as the test case for reviving Section 338 wasn't random. It was, according to the USTR's own public statement from Ambassador Jameson Greer, explicitly framed as a message. Canada, unlike other partners and allies, continues to retaliate against the United States, Greer said in his official statement, adding that the administration was determined to hold Canada accountable for its retaliation and discrimination. It helps to understand the fuller arc of how this dispute even got here, because Section 338 didn't appear out of nowhere in July of 2026. It was the latest chapter in a fight that had already consumed the better part of 2 years. According to analysis from the law firm BLG, the current dispute traces back to November 25th, 2024, when Trump, then president-elect, announced that one of his first executive acts would be a 25% tariff on all Canadian and Mexican goods, tied to concerns about fentanyl trafficking and border security. That threat became reality on February 1st, 2025, when Trump signed Executive Order 14193, invoking a different legal authority, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to impose the tariffs. Canada's response, delivered by then Prime Minister Trudeau, was the more than $100 billion retaliatory package described earlier. Trudeau also presented data at the time showing that only about 1% of the fentanyl entering the United States actually originated in Canada, pushing back directly on the administration's stated justification. Over the following months, according to BLG's tracking of the dispute, the fight escalated through a series of different legal vehicles, each replacing or supplementing the last, until the Supreme Court eventually struck down the IEEPA-based tariffs as unlawful. That ruling forced the administration to look for other statutory tools to maintain pressure on Canada, which is part of why Section 122 of the Trade Act, a bridge authority Trump invoked just 4 days after the IEEPA ruling, briefly became the operative tariff mechanism, before its own 150-day statutory clock expired on July 24, 2026, just days after Section 338 was invoked. Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, autos, and lumber remained in place throughout this entire period, layered on top of whatever the newest authority happened to be. By the time Section 338 entered the picture, Canada had already been living under some form of American tariff pressure for a year and a half, through at least 4 distinct legal mechanisms, which is part of why BLG's analysts described the sheer number of statutory vehicles consumed by this single trade dispute as more than they had anticipated when they began tracking it. That backdrop of tariff fatigue, as some Canadian officials have described it privately according to reporting cited by BLG, may be part of what shaped Carney's calculus in July. After 4 separate rounds of escalating measures, a 5th automatic retaliation may simply have offered diminishing political returns compared to the potential legal and economic risk of triggering Section 338's escalation clause. And it's also worth noting that Ottawa has not been entirely passive across this broader timeline. According to reporting from the Globe and Mail, Canada had already removed 2 significant trade irritants earlier in the year in an effort to ease tensions, scrapping a digital services tax that had drawn American objections, and reversing a planned tax increase on online streaming services. USTR. Ambassador Greer, however, was dismissive of those moves as meaningful concessions. I'm glad they did that, but they don't really get credit for doing something bad and then undoing it, Greer said in a speech reported by the Globe and Mail, raising the question of whether restoring American liquor to store shelves or adjusting dairy quotas would be viewed any more favorably by Washington. One additional detail from the U.S. side helps explain why the administration felt emboldened to escalate against Canada specifically, even while simultaneously managing trade friction with dozens of other countries. According to the White House's own July fact sheet, the administration pointed to domestic manufacturing data to argue its broader tariff strategy was working. U.S. manufacturing, the fact sheet claimed, grew at its fastest rate in 4 years in May of 2026, nearly tripling expectations, and continued expanding through June for a 6th consecutive month. Whether that manufacturing growth is attributable to the tariff strategy specifically, to other economic factors, or some combination, is a matter of ongoing economic debate rather than settled fact, and the fact sheet itself is a White House political document rather than an independent economic analysis. So we present that manufacturing claim as the administration's own stated justification rather than as independently verified causation. Economists watching the currency and bond markets around this dispute have focused less on any single dramatic trading day and more on the slow grind of uncertainty itself. According to market commentary from VT Markets, the Canadian dollar has been trading with elevated volatility specifically because of the Section 338 deadline, with traders weighing Canada's inflation data alongside the tariff timeline as the 2 dominant near-term drivers of the currency's direction. TD Securities, cited in that same reporting, projected Canada's central bank would hold its overnight interest rate steady through the remainder of 2026, suggesting the Bank of Canada itself was treating the trade standoff as a source of uncertainty to be monitored rather than an emergency requiring an immediate policy response. That is itself a data point worth sitting with. Canada's own central bank, as of the most recent available commentary, was not treating this as a crisis-level shock to the economy, which tells you something about how differently professional economists were reading the situation compared to how it may have been framed in less careful summaries online. The scale of what's actually exposed to these new duties deserves a closer look, because 5% of total Canadian imports sounds modest until you break down which specific products and industries sit inside that figure. According to the Global Trade Alert's tracking of the proclamations, the Section 338 action added an additional 50% duty on 554 separate Canadian tariff lines, pushing Canada's overall average tariff rate charged by the United States up by 1.89 percentage points overnight to 6.27%. That analysis also noted an important carve-out. Roughly 82% of Canadian export value by dollar amount still reaches the United States duty-free under the existing Continental Trade Agreement, meaning Section 338, significant as it is, narrows that protection only in the specific sectors named in the three proclamations, rather than dismantling the broader trade relationship wholesale. After accounting for goods already covered by separate Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and autos, the Global Trade Alert calculated that the Section 338 duties specifically cover about $17.7 billion of Canadian goods once those overlaps are excluded. The precedent this sets may matter more than the immediate dollar figures, according to that same analysis. A statute that had been legally dormant since a 1949 telegram from the Secretary of State, raising it as a possible response to Chinese trade discrimination, has now been proven, in practice, capable of overriding a formal trade agreement's core protections on nothing more than a presidential finding, without a prior investigation, without a hearing, and without the kind of extended administrative process that governs most other American tariff tools. Global Trade Alert's analysts flagged this as the real risk going forward. Not the specific dollar amount tied to hockey sticks or cement or wine, but the demonstrated fact that this particular legal mechanism now exists as a viable, court-tested, or soon-to-be tested option. The administration could point at any other trading partner it deems to be retaliating unfairly at any point in the future. Industry groups on the Canadian side, meanwhile, have been quietly working the technical and political angles simultaneously. According to GHY International's client advisory, affected Canadian industry associations have been supplying detailed technical and product data to Canada's Department of Finance, warning of significant export exposure and potential job losses, while pushing for either a full delay of the tariffs or a formal exemption under the existing Continental Trade Agreement. That is the unglamorous, unseen labor behind a trade dispute like this one. Not a single dramatic headline moment, but weeks of technical submissions, legal memos, and closed-door negotiating sessions, running in parallel with the public statements from Carney and Trump that make the news. It's also worth understanding the practical, on-the-ground compliance chaos this kind of sudden legal shift creates for the businesses actually moving goods across the border, because that friction is as real a part of this story as the diplomatic maneuvering in Washington and Ottawa. According to a client advisory from GHY International, the Section 338 tariff is calculated based on the date a shipment is formally entered for consumption at the American border, not the date it physically shipped from a Canadian facility. That distinction, the advisory noted, is likely to catch shippers off guard because Canadian exporters are accustomed to assessing duty relief and tariff timing based on when goods leave their own warehouse. U.S. Customs and Border Protection doesn't work that way. A shipment leaving a Canadian facility on August the 18th, the day before the deadline, could still arrive and be entered into the American market after the 12:01 a.m. cutoff on August the 19th. And if it does, it inherits the full 50% duty regardless of when it actually left Canada. Compliance teams on both sides of the border have reportedly been scrambling to work backward from realistic arrival windows, factoring in transit time and potential border congestion, rather than simply working forward from a planned shipping date. There's a related procedural trap buried in the customs rules that catches an even narrower category of businesses, according to that same GHY advisory and a separate analysis from Thomson Reuters. Goods sitting inside a foreign trade zone, a special customs designation that allows companies to store imported goods without immediately paying duties, generally need to be formally admitted under what's called privileged foreign status before the new tariff's effective date, or they inherit the higher duty automatically once they're eventually pulled out for consumption, even if they physically arrived in the United States long before the Section 338 proclamations were ever signed. Thomson Reuters described a specific scenario compliance teams could easily miss. A company reviews the headline auto, alcohol, and dairy categories when the news breaks in July, confirms its own exposure looks manageable, and moves on with its normal operations, only to have a shipment of Canadian furniture or seed stock flagged at the border weeks later. A product line nobody thought to check in the first place because it never appeared in any of the headline coverage, buried instead in the fine print of Annex 2. So where does this actually stand as of this recording? As of the most recent reporting available from CBC News, Prime Minister Carney has not announced retaliatory tariffs of any kind and continues to describe the ongoing talks as delicate and intense, with a direct call to President Trump expected within days of the August 19th deadline. Whether that call produces an 11th-hour deal, a formal delay similar to the extensions some trade lawyers had predicted might follow this kind of proclamation, or the tariffs actually taking effect as scheduled, remains genuinely unresolved at the time of this recording. Analysts at the trade law blog Run Out of Stanford's Law School noted, even in the immediate aftermath of the July 20th announcement, a degree of skepticism that the White House's own 30-day deadline would be treated as a hard cutoff. suggesting instead that a series of short extensions could keep the Section 338 threat hanging over the relationship for some time, functioning more as continuous negotiating leverage than a one-time event. Before we close, here's the honest accounting of where every claim in this video came from and where real uncertainty remains. The details of Section 338 itself, its historical dormancy since the 1940s, and the July 20th signing date come from multiple law firm client alerts, including White & Case, Holland & Knight, GHY International, and Wiley, all of which independently confirm the same core facts. Scott Lincecum's Rubicon quote comes from Tech Times' reporting. The USTR's own figures on tariff coverage and Ambassador Greer's statement come directly from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative's published materials. Carney's public statements and Canada's negotiating posture come from reporting by The Hill, CBC News, The Globe and Mail, and Benzinga. The historical comparison to Trudeau's 2025 response comes from Wire reporting published at the time. The legal questions around whether provincial actions can be attributed to the federal Canadian government under Section 338 and whether the statute will survive a court challenge remain genuinely unresolved and contested among trade lawyers, and we flagged that explicitly rather than presenting either outcome as certain. And to be fully transparent one final time, we could not verify through any named source a specific dramatic Wall Street market reaction directly tied to a single Canadian countermove in the way some circulating summaries of this story suggest. What we can confirm on the record is that Ottawa's actual strategic surprise was its restraint, and whether that patient negotiate rather than retaliate approach pays off for Canada is still an open question, with the clock now running out before the August 19th deadline. It's worth remembering, too, that this entire dispute is unfolding against the backdrop of the two countries' broader trade relationship being formally reopened for renegotiation. According to the law firm MLT Aikens, the United States declined to renew the USMCA in its current form when the agreement's mandatory 6-year review came up, which means Section 338 isn't operating in isolation. It's one pressure point inside a much larger negotiation over what the entire continental trading relationship looks like going forward. A negotiation that, according to CSIS, has moved considerably faster on the American side with Mexico than it has with Canada. That imbalance, some analysts have suggested, may itself be part of Washington's strategy, applying maximum pressure on the slower-moving Canadian track, while the Mexican track advances toward what could become a template Canada eventually has to match or better. Whether Ottawa closes that gap before, during, or well after the current 30-day tariff clock runs out remains, like so much else in this story, genuinely unresolved. So here's what we'd like to know from you. Given that retaliating has been Canada's default response for 18 months straight, do you think Mark Carney's decision to hold back this time is a smarter, more sustainable strategy? Or is it a gamble that risks looking weak to both Washington and to Canadians who've been bracing for a fight? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this is the kind of dispute where the real story is happening in negotiating rooms rather than in a single dramatic headline, we think that's worth understanding clearly, not just skimming past. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.